John Kennedy and a farmer have a heated debate, but what happens next is unexpected. Senator John Kennedy, with his sharp Louisiana drawl and reputation for cutting through political fluff, wasn't one to be easily rattled. Known for his folksy charm and incisive wit, he'd faced down opponents in debates and charmed crowds with quips that landed like well-aimed darts. But on a quiet morning in his Washington office, a handwritten letter stopped him cold. It wasn't the usual polished correspondence from lobbyists or constituents with neatly typed requests. This was raw, scrawled in black ink on plain paper from a man named James Carter, a third-generation farmer from a speck of a town in the Midwest. The letter didn't mince words, Senator Kennedy. If you really care about farmers, come to my farm. We're dying out here, and I want you to see it with your own eyes. No pleasantries, no flattery, just a challenge. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, the letter crinkling in his hand. "Who's this James Carter think he is?" he muttered, half amused, half intrigued. His advisers, when he showed them the letter, urged him to toss it. "It's just one farmer, Senator," one said. "You've got bigger fish to fry." But something about the letter's bluntness hooked him. He'd built his career on straight talk, and here was someone calling his bluff. "Get me a car," he said. "I'm going to see this man." His team blinked, stunned. To a farm. In the middle of nowhere, Kennedy grinned. "If I can't handle a farmer, I don't deserve this job." A week later, his convoy, 2 black SUVs, and a security detail rolled down a dusty road flanked by endless rows of corn, under a wide, cloudless sky. The air smelled of earth and diesel, a far cry from the sterile halls of the Capitol. James Carter stood waiting in front of a weathered farmhouse, his overalls faded and patched, his hands rough from years of toil. He wiped them on a rag and extended one for a firm handshake. "Senator, thanks for coming," he said, his voice steady but edged with skepticism. "I'll be straight with you, no sugarcoating." Kennedy, in a crisp suit that looked wildly out of place, flashed his trademark grin. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Mr. Carter." The Secret Service agents fanned out their eyes, scanning the horizon, but James ignored them, leading Kennedy toward the porch. The house was modest, its paint peeling a creaky screen door swinging in the breeze. Inside the kitchen was warm, cluttered, with the kind of lived-in chaos that spoke of a family stretched thin. A stack of unpaid bills sat on the counter next to a chipped coffee mug and a faded photo of James's kids playing in the fields. James gestured at the pile. "This is what we're dealing with, Senator. Corn prices are in the dirt, fuel costs are through the roof, and fertilizer's more expensive than ever. You know what that's like for folks like me." Kennedy, leaning against the counter, crossed his arms. "I've fought for farmers, James. We've got trade deals, subsidies more than most administrations have done." His tone was confident, but James wasn't having it. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Subsidies. Those go to the big dogs, corporate farms that buy up land or like it's monopoly. Small farmers like me, we're drowning." The air crackled with tension. Kennedy raised an eyebrow, used to sparring, but not to being called out so directly. "That's the free market, son," he said. "You compete or you get out." James slammed a fist on the table, making the coffee mug jump. "Compete. This ain't competition. This is being crushed by folks with deeper pockets than God." The Secret Service agents shifted uneasily, their hands hovering near their radios, unsure if this was about to escalate. James's wife, Emily, appeared in the doorway, her apron dusted with flour. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "let's take a breath and sit down." She set a plate of homemade cornbread and roasted chicken on the table, the kind of meal that carried the weight of tradition. "Eat something. Maybe it'll cool your heads." Kennedy, sensing the need to dial things back, took a seat, his polished shoes looking absurd against the scuffed wooden floor. He bit into the cornbread, its warmth and simplicity grounding him. "This is good," he said, almost surprised. Emily offered a sad smile. "We grow the corn, raise the chickens, but we barely make enough at the market to keep the lights on. That's what struggling America tastes like, Senator." Kennedy chewed slowly, his eyes drifting to the walls, family photos, a cross-stitched Bible verse, a crack snaking through the plaster. For the first time, he saw beyond the policy briefs and economic reports. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about people, families, lives. James sat across from him, his calloused hands folded. "Farming's not just a job, Senator. It's who we are. My granddaddy worked this land, my daddy too. Now my kids might not get the chance because banks see us as risks while corporations get handouts." Kennedy leaned forward, his usual quick wit replaced by a rare pause. "I hear you, James, but fixing a system like this takes time." James scoffed. "Time? We're out of time. Every year, another farm goes under. You gonna tell me to wait while my kids lose their future?" The room grew quiet, the only sound the hum of a refrigerator that looked older than Kennedy's Senate career. Emily broke the silence, her voice gentle but firm. "Senator, you're here now. That's something. But words don't plow fields." Kennedy nodded, his mind racing. He'd come expecting a quick visit, maybe a photo op, but this was different. James wasn't asking for pity. He was demanding answers. "All right," Kennedy said, standing. "Show me what you do out here. Let me see it." James raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "You sure? This ain't a boardroom?" Kennedy chuckled, loosening his tie. "I've wrestled tougher things than a farm." James led him outside to a battered John Deere tractor, its green paint chipped and rusted. "Hop on," he said, pointing to the driver's seat. Kennedy hesitated, his suit jacket flapping in the breeze, then climbed up, gripping the wheel like a man out of his element. James stood beside him, pointing out the controls. "This is what feeds America, Senator. Not speeches, not policies, dirt and sweat." Kennedy eased the tractor forward, the machine lurching as he struggled to keep it straight. A row of uneven furrows trailed behind him, and James couldn't hide a grin. "Not bad for a city boy, but you'd starve if this was your job." Kennedy laughed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Point taken." They walked the fields, James pointing out the dry patches where irrigation had failed the equipment, held together with duct tape and prayers. "This land's been in my family for generations," James said, kicking a clod of dirt. "But hard work ain't enough anymore. Banks foreclose, corporations buy cheap, and we're left with nothing." Kennedy stopped, looking out at the horizon, the endless rows of crops stretching under a fading sun. For once, he didn't have a quick comeback. He saw the weight of James's words, the reality of a life tied to the land, and the fragility of a system that seemed stacked against men like him. "What do you want from me, James?" he asked, his voice quieter now. James met his gaze. "Not handouts, not promises. We need policies that protect us, not just the big players. We're the backbone of this country, Senator. Act like it." Kennedy nodded, his usual swagger tempered by something new, respect, maybe even humility. As the convoy prepared to leave, Kennedy lingered on the porch, glancing back at the farmhouse. The image of James's hands, cracked and stained with soil, stuck with him. He'd come expecting a debate he could win, but instead he'd been schooled in a way no Senate hearing ever could. James watched the SUVs disappear down the road, unsure if his words had landed. He'd spoken his truth, but would it matter? Kennedy in the back seat stared out the window, the fields blurring past. For the first time in a long time, He felt the weight of his office not as a platform for winning arguments, but as a chance to make a difference. The letter still tucked in his briefcase wasn't just a challenge anymore. It was a call to action. If you've been moved by James and Emily's story and want to support more tales of real people making a difference, consider donating to our channel. Your contributions help us keep bringing these powerful narratives to life, giving a voice to the unsung heroes of America's heartland. Every dollar counts, and together we can shine a light on the issues that matter most. Visit our website to donate today, and join the movement to tell stories that change the world. Back in Washington, Senator John Kennedy couldn't shake the image of James Carter's weathered hands or the stack of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter. The visit to the Midwest farm had been a jolt, a stark contrast to the polished briefings and air-conditioned Senate chambers he was used to. James's words, "We're the backbone of this country, Senator," act like it echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. Kennedy, known for his quick wit and ability to dodge political traps, found himself restless. He'd faced tough opponents before, but this wasn't about winning a debate. It was about a man, a family, a way of life on the brink. He called his chief of staff into his office, a cluttered space lined with law books and a framed map of Louisiana. "Get me everything you can on small farms," he said, tossing James's letter onto the desk. "Bankruptcies, corporate land, grabs, subsidies, the works."
His staffer, a young woman named Clara, who'd seen Kennedy tackle countless issues, raised an eyebrow.
"You're diving into agriculture now, Senator. That's a deep swamp." Kennedy leaned back, his drawl sharp. "If I can't wade through a swamp, I'm in the wrong job." Over the next few days, reports piled up on his desk charts, showing thousands of family farms vanishing each year, statistics on how corporate agribusiness controlled over 60% of arable land and data on subsidies that flowed disproportionately to massive conglomerates. One number hit him hard. Small farmers like James received less than 10% of federal agricultural aid, despite producing nearly a third of the nation's food. The system, Kennedy realized, wasn't just tilted, it was rigged. He thought of James's kids running through fields that might not be theirs in a decade, and felt a rare pang of urgency. He'd always prided himself on understanding the little guy, but this was different. This was personal. He picked up the phone and dialed James's number, catching him in the middle of fixing a broken irrigation pump. "Mr. Carter," Kennedy said, "I need you in Washington. We're going to talk about what's next." James, wiping sweat from his brow, let out a skeptical laugh. "You serious, Senator? I'm no politician." Kennedy's voice was firm. "Exactly why I need you. Pack a bag." A week later, James stepped off a bus in D.C., his work boots and flannel shirt standing out like a sore thumb among the city's sea of suits. He felt like a fish out of water, clutching a worn notebook where he'd scribbled ideas from late-night talks with Emily and other farmers in his town. Kennedy's office was a whirlwind of activity phones ringing, aides rushing with folders, the hum of power in the air. James sat across from Kennedy at a mahogany table flanked by a half-dozen advisors in tailored clothes. Clara, the chief of staff, opened the meeting. "Mr. Carter, the senator, wants your input on agricultural policy. Let's start with the challenges you're facing." James didn't hesitate. "Let's call it what it is, a disaster. Small farmers are going broke because corporations buy up land at bargain prices, drive down crop values, and scoop up subsidies we can't touch. Meanwhile, banks treat us like we're radioactive." One advisor, a bespectacled man with a stack of spreadsheets, pushed back. "The market rewards efficiency, Mr. Carter. Large farms produce more at lower costs. That's economics." James leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. "Economics. You tell that to my neighbor who lost his farm after 50 years. You tell that to my kids who might never get to work this land. This ain't efficiency, it's extinction." Kennedy listened, his usual penchant for quips replaced by a focused silence. He'd expected James to be blunt, but the rawness of his words cut through the room's bureaucratic haze. Another advisor, a woman with a clipped tone, chimed in. "We have programs in place, loan guarantees, crop insurance. What more do you need?" James opened his notebook, revealing pages of cramped handwriting. "We need loans we can actually qualify for, not ones that demand collateral we don't have. We need roads and irrigation systems that don't cost an arm and a leg to maintain. And we need someone to stop corporations from rigging prices so we can't compete." The advisors exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for such directness. Kennedy tapped his pen on the table. "All right, James, say we write a bill. What's it gotta do?" James didn't blink. "Protect small farmers. Cap how much land corporations can buy. Redirect subsidies to folks like me, not billion-dollar companies. And make sure trade deals don't screw us over with cheap imports." The room went quiet. Clara scribbled notes, her expression a mix of skepticism and intrigue. "That's a tall order," she said. "It'll face pushback, big pushback." James shrugged. "You asked what we need. I'm telling you." Over the next hour, the discussion grew heated. One advisor argued that disrupting the market could spike food prices. Another warned of legal battles from corporate lobbyists. James didn't budge, recounting stories from his town families forced to sell their land, kids leaving for cities because farming wasn't viable anymore. Kennedy, watching James hold his own against a room of policy wonks, felt a grudging respect. This wasn't just a farmer. This was a man fighting for survival. Finally, Kennedy raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I'm saying we'll try. James, I want you on a council, farmers, not suits, advising me directly. You in?" James hesitated, glancing at his notebook. He wasn't a politician, wasn't even comfortable in this city, but he thought of Emily, his kids, his neighbors. "I'm in," he said, "but only if you mean it." Kennedy grinned. "Son, I don't waste plane tickets on folks I don't mean to work with." Back at the farm, James told Emily about the meeting over a late dinner of leftover stew. "They listened, but I don't know if they'll act," he said, his voice heavy. Emily squeezed his hand. "You got a senator to listen, James. That's more than most ever do." Meanwhile, Kennedy threw himself into drafting a bill. He called in agricultural economists, rural infrastructure experts, even a few maverick lawyers who'd taken on corporate giants before. The bill took shape: low-interest loans for small farmers, tax breaks for family-run operations, restrictions on corporate land purchases, and a review of trade policies to protect domestic growers. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Clara, reviewing the draft, shook her head. "This'll ruffle feathers, Senator. Big Ag won't like it." Kennedy leaned back, a glint in his eye. "Good. If they're comfortable we're doing something wrong." The bill hit the Senate floor like a thunderclap. Lobbyists from corporate farms descended on Washington, warning of economic chaos. Some of Kennedy's colleagues, wary of upsetting powerful donors, urged him to water it down. But every time he wavered, he thought of James's kitchen, the cracked plaster, the weight of a life tied to the land. He pushed forward, giving speeches that blended his usual humor with a new edge of conviction. Folks, farmers aren't just growing corn, they're growing America. If we let them go under, we're pulling the rug out from under ourselves. The media took notice, and so did farmers across the country. James started getting calls from strangers, Farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas. You said what we've all been thinking, one said. Keep fighting. James, who'd never wanted to be a spokesman, felt the weight of their hopes settling on his shoulders. One evening, as the Senate debated the bill, Kennedy called James. They're tearing it apart in there, he said, his voice tired but determined. But we're not done. You got any more of that cornbread? I might need some fuel. James laughed the first time he'd felt hope in months. Come back to the farm, Senator. We'll feed you. As he hung up, James looked out at his fields, the sun setting over rows of struggling crops. He didn't know if the bill would pass, but for the first time, he felt like someone in power was listening. Kennedy, back in his office, stared at a photo from the farm visit him awkwardly steering that tractor, James grinning beside him. He wasn't just fighting for a bill anymore. He was fighting for a man who'd dared to speak truth to power, and for the millions like him. The battle was just beginning, and neither of them was backing down. The Senate chamber buzzed with the aftermath of the vote. After months of heated debates, late-night negotiations, and relentless pressure from corporate lobbyists, Senator John Kennedy's bill had passed narrowly, but it passed. The new legislation wasn't a cure, all but it was a lifeline for small farmers like James Carter. Low-interest loans were now accessible to family-run operations. Rural infrastructure like roads and irrigation systems would see new funding, and regulations curbed the ability of agribusiness giants to manipulate crop prices. Back at his farm, James sat on the porch, a rare moment of quiet settling over him as he watched his children chase each other through the fields. The weight of debt still loomed, but for the first time in years, there was a flicker of hope, a chance to keep the land that had been in his family for generations. Emily joined him, her eyes reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. You did this, James, she said softly. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Not just me. Kennedy listened when no one else would. But the fight wasn't over, and James knew it. The bill was a start, but farming was still a battle against unpredictable weather, rising costs, and a system that often favored the powerful. What James didn't expect was that his role in this fight was far from done. A few weeks later, a black SUV rolled onto the farm, kicking up dust on the familiar dirt road. James, elbow deep in repairing a fence, squinted as Senator Kennedy stepped out, this time without the entourage of advisors or Secret Service agents. He wore a simple button-up shirt, his suit left behind in Washington. Thought I'd check on that cornbread supply, Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during their first meeting. James wiped his hands on his overalls, chuckling. You're a long way from the Capitol for a snack senator. Kennedy's visit wasn't about food, though. He walked with James through the fields, asking pointed questions about the challenges that lingered. Droughts worsened by climate shifts, a shortage of young workers willing to take up farming equipment so outdated it broke down weekly. The bills helping, James admitted, pointing to a new irrigation pipe funded by a government grant. But it's a band-aid. We need long-term fixes, better weather forecasting training programs for the next generation. Kennedy nodded, scribbling notes on a small pad he'd pulled from his pocket. Keep talking, James. I'm all ears. It struck James that this wasn't the same man who'd arrived months ago, ready to defend the free market with a quick quip. Kennedy was listening, really listening, and it felt like a small miracle. The visit took a turn when Kennedy proposed something unexpected. There's a community meeting in town next week, he said. Farmers from all over are coming. I want you to speak. James froze, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Me, I'm no public speaker. Kennedy grinned. You don't need to be. You've got something better, truth. James hesitated, his mind flashing to the countless nights he'd stayed up worrying about the farm, the letters he'd written to politicians who never responded, the neighbors who'd lost everything. Maybe this was his chance to do more than save his own land. He agreed, and a week later he stood in a crowded town hall surrounded by weathered faces, farmers from across the state, some who'd driven hours to be there. The room smelled of coffee and hay, and the air was thick with anticipation. Kennedy introduced James, his voice booming. "This man woke me up to what's happening out here. Listen to him." James gripped the podium, his hands trembling, but his voice steady. "We're not asking for charity," he said. "We're asking for a fair shot. Corporations get bailouts, tax breaks, loopholes. All we want is the chance to keep feeding this country." He shared stories his own, his neighbors, the widow down the road who'd sold her farm to a conglomerate for pennies. The crowd nodded, some wiping tears, others clapping fiercely. One farmer, a grizzled man in a worn cap, stood up. "James, you're saying what we've all felt for years. What do we do next?" That question sparked a movement. James, with Kennedy's backing, helped organize a coalition of small farmers, a network that stretched across state lines. They called it the Heartland Alliance, a grassroots effort to amplify their voices. Farmers shared resources, lobbied for better policies, and held town halls to educate communities about the stakes. James, once just a man trying to save his farm, became a reluctant leader. Reporters started showing up, their cameras flashing as he spoke at rallies or met with local officials. "I'm no hero," he told one journalist, his voice gruff. "I'm just a farmer who got tired of being ignored." Kennedy, meanwhile, faced his own battles in Washington. Corporate lobbyists doubled down, flooding his office with calls and veiled threats about campaign funding. Some colleagues warned him to back off, calling the bill a political risk. But Kennedy, emboldened by the farmers' stories, dug in. At a press conference, he held up a photo of James's farm. "This is America," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "If we let these folks fail, we're letting America fail." The crowd erupted, and for once the political divide seemed to blur. Farmers, workers, and families saw a senator who wasn't just posturing, he was fighting. The Heartland Alliance grew, and James's phone rang constantly. Farmers from Iowa, Ohio, even as far as California, thanking him, asking for advice, sharing their struggles. One call came from a young woman whose family had lost their dairy farm. "You gave us hope, James," she said. "We're starting over and we're not giving up." James, sitting at his kitchen table, felt the weight of those words. He wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for hers, for all of them. Kennedy called one evening, his voice crackling over the line. "You've started something big, James. I'm putting you on a national advisory board. Farmers, not bureaucrats, shaping policy. You ready?" James glanced at Emily, who nodded, her eyes bright with pride. "I'm not a politician, Senator," he said. "But if it helps farmers, I'll do it." Kennedy laughed. "That's why you're perfect." Months later, James stood in his fields watching his son and daughter run through the rows of corn, their laughter carrying on the breeze. The farm wasn't out of the woods, but it was breathing. New equipment sat in the barn, funded by a loan he could actually afford. The irrigation system hummed, and for the first time in years, James wasn't afraid to check the mail for foreclosure notices. Emily wrapped an arm around him. "You changed things, James." He shook his head. "We did. All of us." Across the country, farmers felt a shift, policies that saw them voices that mattered. It had started with a letter, a challenge, a heated debate in a small kitchen. Now it was a movement, and James, just a farmer, had become its heart. Kennedy, back in Washington, kept a photo of James's farm on his desk, a reminder of why he fought. The work wasn't done, but for the first time, farmers weren't fighting alone.